I'ma trust the whole damn process for the record, till we breaking records. Reminisce about the past days, now we rise and fly. Journeys to the sky, azimuth inside my grip, always know the way now. Beauty fill my days now, take it day by day. Sound couldn't be prouder, cause you know we alive. Hey.
Hi everyone, welcome to In Process. As always, I'm your host, Andrés Moreno, and this is Azimuth Theater's podcast highlighting artists, their artistry, and their process. Today, we're going to speak to the one and only Pseudo-Antigone, a singer, songwriter, philosopher, and an all-around amazing person. Hi.
Hey, how's it going, Andrés?
It's good. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I'm very excited for us to dive deep and to be able to just chat.
Me as well. You know, every opportunity to get to chat about process, it's something that I really adore. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I'll start with just asking you if you can tell us a little bit about your story, how your life has kind of led you to this point in your life when you're an artist, and kind of have that mixed.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit of an all over the place kind of situation. I want to say that my relationship with art is pretty long term. Like since I was really young, I was known to do a lot of art, particularly actually visual art. I used to do comic books when I was a younger one. And then around the time that I was 10 years old, I started doing music. I picked up a guitar. And so for the longest time, like I've been playing guitar almost for about 2 decades. So it's very different from what I do now because I'm mostly doing electronic music these days. But yeah, I started doing music around, I want to say 17 years ago now. And that's pretty wild now I come to think of it. And yeah, my background is pretty all over the place too. First of all, I'm an immigrant, so I come from Mexico City. That's where I was born, and I came here to Canada in 2008. So that's been pretty significant in terms of like changes in just everything about my life. Just systematically changes everything. And so a lot of my work in philosophy, in psychoanalysis, in art, sometimes takes some reflection on the consequences of that change. So as I kind of alluded to, I have a background in psychoanalysis and philosophy. Formerly, I have BA in philosophy. That's my major. And I also have a background in arts management. Aside from my work as Pseudo-Antigone, I'm also the festival producer for the Next Fest Arts Company. And aside from that, I tend to be very involved in a lot of different like arts projects and communities and whatnot. So yeah, that would kind of encompass a lot of what I do. It's pretty all over the place. Right now with Pseudo-Antigone, I mostly do electronic music in the kind of genre I would call hyperpop. But hyperpop is also a little bit of a misnomer, so we can talk more about that down the line.
Totally. Now, you were mentioning when you were younger, you did comic books, like you used to write them and to illustrate them?
Yes, I used to particularly illustrate comic books. I used to write them. The plot lines make no sense. The characters are not characters. But I just wanted to do something, and that's kind of what I ended up doing. I want to say what I was doing was fan fiction. I just didn't realize I was doing fan fiction till like 10, 15 years later.
Franchises have been built on fan fiction, as we know, so...
I love fan fiction. Actually, because my BA was in philosophy and English, I got really into critical theory and those discussions because that was the place where I could talk about fan fiction.
That's rad. Sorry, I know we're talking about your music, but I just like the idea that you also like created comic books.
Yeah, that's what I started doing, honestly. Like there was a point in my life where I thought I would just keep going on the visual arts direction. I was thinking about it actually fairly recently. And I still do some level of visual arts, particularly in digital collaging. But my center and focus is really music and my work in philosophy.
Cool. Now, coming back to your music, you were mentioning that you've played guitar for about 2 decades now. Do you find that with the hyperpop and electronic music that you're producing nowadays, does that theory kind of sneak in there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, I did know a little bit of music theory because of how I learned guitar. I would never say that I'm like a fully technical person because I can't talk about like modes of scales. That's something that goes a little over my head, but I know enough theory that I know how to intuit what I want to do with music. I want to say because I mostly started playing on MIDI keyboards, which are laid out like pianos. I know the layout. I know what it means. I know how to understand, chords, scales, just the general layout of what I'm trying to do there. So as you know, I got really comfortable on guitar because I was able to intuit the music there. And after a year of doing stuff on a MIDI keyboard, I become more comfortable being able to intuit that sort of like musical process in that setting.
I'm always so in awe at people who can pick up music just because my brain works the opposite. So when people are like, oh, I taught myself, I'm always in awe.
It's a lot and it's weirdly mathematical. That's the thing. And this is kind of where philosophy comes into play for me. I have a very strong sense of abstract thinking that I'm able to think abstractly even in music because I can have an abstract concept and know how to put it into like practice or realize it. And so I can have abstract ideas and being able to see how those abstract ideas kind of translate between various different particular instances where you can see them reflected. It's really weird. It's pretty odd. I find with music especially, it gets odd because music sometimes has this weird overlap with mathematics. And that's why I refer to abstract thinking because it's pretty abstract in terms of like how we set relationships between different tones, even the tonality that is pretty common in the Western world, like how that's established, how we set relationship between like the notes that go on to compose like accords, how we can emphasize certain elements of like music structuring and whatnot. It's wild. It definitely gets into my head a lot.
I
Yeah.
could listen to you talk forever. Like the fact that you're talking math when we're talking about music, I live for it.
Yeah, there's a weird overlap. I'm here for it.
We've talked about how you have done art in different forms and in different mediums your whole life. However, what drew you to then go, I'm going to express myself through music?
Okay, so for me, I think a lot of the things I do in art sometimes relate to what I do in philosophy. I basically operate on the basic notion that philosophy is something that comes into touch with a lot of non-philosophical disciplines. In the instance of the arts, I'm able to try to articulate what would be an abstract philosophical concept in different sorts of like more particular sensibilities of art. So sometimes it's a question of like how am I able to do both the work of like the abstract, like I don't know how to put it, but like more logical laboring that would go on to the philosophical treatise, let's say, and trying to articulate those things also in the narrative of a play, poetry, music, all of these things as different access points, let's say, to talk about the concepts that ultimately philosophy is concerned with. So it's not just music, but music in particular, I find that I have a lot of strengths in terms of my, how would I put it, like competency at it. So I feel like my leanings towards music have been more because, I feel very comfortable with this medium. I feel like I know what I'm doing more. And especially as I'm starting to do the project that is now Pseudo-Antigone, I feel like I have a lot of room for, dealing with more complex topics over time.
And talking about the name, Pseudo-Antigone, what drew you to that name?
I mean, I do love the play by Sophocles, but that also ties in both to philosophy and psychoanalysis. Because one of my favorite philosophers, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and one of my favorite psychoanalysts, Jacques Lacan, both take a particular interest on Antigone as this kind of figure of rebellion, would be the most simple way I could put it. In the case of Hegel, it tends to deal with this narrative where, we can set up universal rules and whatnot about how we set up a state, let's say. But these things can undermine the particular desires and particular needs or relationships that people build with each other. In the case of the play of Antigone, well, the play entails that the statesman Creon refuses to give burial to one of Antigone's brothers because two of her brothers fought in a war together, but in opposite sides. One of the brothers fought on the side of the city, and the other one did not. The one that did not was denied burial. So he was basically at the excess of the political state. And so when Antigone heard about this news, she was devastated and dealt with the question of, can I try to mourn this person who has been, in a sense, excommunicated from the state? So in a sense, she basically took on the role of trying to still give a sort of like symbolic gesture to the brother that was basically denied any role in the state. She was trying to actively rebel and completely shake the foundations of what the state was built upon by basically saying that the state had no claim of denying that symbolic inscription of mourning from these folks. The play does culminate in that Creon finds out about Antigone trying to, perform burial ritual for her brother. And she gets a warning first, but she keeps on doing it, of course. And she gets into the situation where she's set in a, how would I put it, in a cave, basically closed off, where she's not able to, in a sense, like she's not killed, but she's sitting in a cave closed off where she has no option but to take her own life,
Huh.
basically. And that's very taboo in the Greek context. So it was this situation where the statesman who is supposed to be upholding, the rules, the rights, all these kinds of things, basically led this person onto both a symbolic death and a real death in some layer. And so for Hegel, it's very much this kind of contention between, the state and the expression of like particular desires overriding the very foundations of the rules that we make. Similar with Lacan, it's slightly different, but along the same lines.
I took a Greek and Roman literature class back in college. You remind me of the professor. Every time they would start talking about these stories, I'd be like, yeah? And then what happened?
And it gets so dramatic sometimes. Yeah, with Antigone, I just really like the kind of expression of radicality. I think that's what I would put to it. This sort of like, the state can burn if we can mourn the people that we stand by. And that stands for me particularly in terms of like navigating my relationship to my immigration and being an immigrant, my relationship to other people around me that struggle with marginality. With myself as a queer person and navigating, queer chosen families and whatnot, I've thought about the notion of what if I were to make, how would I put it, a sort of rendition of Antigone, where it would be centered around the notion of queer chosen family that has no claim to mourning one of their own who's passed away just because they don't have a blood relationship. In one sense or another, it still confronts us with the fundamental dilemma of Antigone, just in a modernized setting. And that's the significance of modernizing Antigone's drama in some sense. What is the kind of conflict with the state, with the rules that we make, that it makes apparent along the way?
I love that this beautiful classic story is also tied into the idea of chosen family and this world that we as queer people have to navigate, right? Of like state versus like our own grief and our own like rebellion.
Yeah, because I think Antigone also, like Antigone comes from a place of care. At the end of the day, like she's trying to express a sort of love that is not state mandated or legalistic, so to speak. One can think of, for example, like before the legalization of like quote unquote homosexual like marriage, like we find these instances where the state tries to legislate how one can love and how one can care. But it also means it simultaneously means how the state can sever us from the kind of care and love that we can express to each other. And as much as like, let's say Antigone can be politicized as a radical in some sense, and properly so because she's hitting at the very roots of the foundation of society, it's also simultaneously asking in what those foundations are founded or what grounds or justifies these foundations, especially when it, in a sense, uproots us or severs us from our most foundational relationships. In the case of her, like her relationship to a close person to her. Yeah.
It reminds me, I don't know if you've heard or seen the play The Normal Heart by Larry Kramer. There's a movie that was made by HBO as well. But in that movie, there's this beautiful love story between two men. And it's in the middle of the AIDS pandemic. And it talks about like what happened to relationships when if you weren't married because it wasn't accepted or even recognized, like you had no right to say goodbye to this person who was your lover,
I think the language of recognition is perfect. This actually comes back to Hegel. In one of the portions of his major text, The Phenomenology Spirit, he has this dialectic, this kind of logic between two different oppositions as they kind of complement and inform each other. He has this dialectic of recognition and desire. How I said that, for example, I may desire in such a way that my desire is immediate to me, but I don't know how to make that desire apparent to someone else. We start finding ourselves trying to contend with our capacity to articulate our own desire, let's say using language, and make that recognizable to another. But of course, language faults us. If there's anything that poetry teaches us, is that language is an improper tool, and that's why we do metaphors, because we try to lever the wealth of expression out of a failed language. So we struggle with trying to make metaphors around our desire to gain recognition amongst each other. And at each failure, we try to do that again. I think this is very tangible in just like friendships or intimate relationships, where we are constantly doing this kind of dialectic of recognition with one another. Of course, when we're talking about it in the case of Antigone, we're not just talking about, these immediate relationships, but also state recognition, let's say.
Totally. And now this beautiful kind of idea of this character who comes from all the way in this like old story and bringing it forward and now going, I'm going to use that name to create hyperpop.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so the name is Pseudo-Antigone. So it's not Antigone, but pseudo, it can mean a few things. It can mean fake, it can mean like. For me, it kind of means like trying to embody something like Antigone.
Right.
Something that it kind of aims at those, like, at tearing down the roots of like something that is fundamentally uprooting, like an uprooting state of inequality or, alienation. And so for me, Pseudo-Antigone was a form of embodiment. Therefore, the pseudo of Antigone, right? Like, we're dealing with an embodiment that is like Antigone. But what it means for me, too, is a sort of experiment in embodiment. The project, Pseudo-Antigone, kind of came at a time where I was trying to explore my transition. Because since 2020, I started the process of doing my medical transitioning, because I don't think I mentioned this before, but I identify as a trans woman, and I have for a while. It's just because of circumstances of, state alienation and whatnot, like the resources haven't been there for me to be able to access something like HRT or any other procedures that I would be interested on pursuing. And so 2020, right before the pandemic happened, I was not in a good place, and we can chat about that. I'm open to it. But I made the decision to go ahead and go through my transition. And so by the time that June hit, well, it was apparent the pandemic was going to go way longer than any of us maybe expected.
Yeah.
And I just tried to embrace it as much as I could, because I had gotten a hold of my HRT, and I realized, like, well, at this point, I'm just going to carry myself to this very personal process now, especially as I was going through some major changes in, who my friends were, where I found myself in society, because none of the spaces where I found community or relationships were the same anymore. I took that time to very much focus on what it meant to embody myself again. And part of that took place in music. So Pseudo-Antigone started as a form of contending with this re-embodiment of myself. What was the rest of the question? I just got caught up on the embodiment thing.
It was the beautiful answer. I was just kind of like how that connects to hyperpop
Oh,
as
yeah.
a genre, you know?
Okay, we can talk about it a little bit. And I think this ties into the trans part of it. My contention with my own embodiment is, I would almost describe it like a cyborg learning to embody itself. How do you learn to embody yourself when you're replacing parts of your body, or like, breaking yourself apart so you can pull yourself back together again? I would say that's kind of what I found myself in, and what I saw in the genre hyperpop. It's kind of a misnomer because it encompasses so many different kinds of music, so it's not even helpful. And as much as like some people, including myself, like to say that it's kind of like a queer community, it's not necessarily so. But I found a lot of like trans and queer community in that, or I should say like trans and queer folks that I saw working music that I really admire. So among them, I would probably I'll start with two of them. Sophie, who passed away earlier this year in an accident, and Arca. Yeah, both Sophie and Arca are trans. Arca is a non-binary trans person who is basically, I want to say the last two records that I'm going to use its pronouns for Arca, because that's what Arca uses. But yeah, Arca in its projects in the last couple years have taken this dawn of navigating transition pretty openly and entering into the sort of like cyborg, post-human, almost inhuman approach to navigating this trans embodiment. There's the music video for Non-Binary, the introduction track to its last album, where Arca basically undergoes like sex reassignment surgery, and it is basically this like complex narrative of dealing with, these like mythological figures of the divine feminine and the cyborg notion of the woman that has become more contemporaneous in some ways. Arca jumps between the two figures in doing the song about being non-binary, and it all ends into an argument with some random like white cis woman on the street.
Oh.
Just like putting into perspective that all this like extraneous, almost alien process, sometimes you just deal with it in a very like backhanded way, just in everyday life.
Yeah.
With someone who is just willing to disregard the kind of multitudes and magnitudes that one is dealing with in doing this process of embodiment. So Arca, I find that does that work pretty explicitly. And also Sophie. Sophie kind of kept her identity undisclosed for a long time, until I want to say the release of her very last album, Oil of Every Pearl's Own Insides, where she finally revealed who she was and that she was a trans woman, starting with the track It's Okay to Cry, where the way I interpret it, but I could be mistaken, is that Sophie was entering into a dialogue with herself pre-transition and kind of having this kind of heart-to-heart conversation about, it's okay to let yourself embody that. And you leave this very emotional, sentimental track to move on to stuff like Pony Boy or Face Shopping or Immaterial, where you're just dealing with all these questions that are more like, electronic, metallic clang-clanging expressions of like embodying yourself. Very similar to art in some ways. Like the music video for Face Shopping has many of these almost like cyborg elements kind of come into
Yes.
play. And we can talk a little bit about this in the context of like what it means to embody a voice in music, especially from a trans perspective. In a recent interview I did, I kind of noted there's 3 ways I've seen trans people navigate this in this kind of genre. One can be like Sophie, who we only really heard Sophie's voice once in It's Okay to Cry. Every other instance of hearing Sophie's voice in her recordings, it tends to be other musicians like Cecile Believe, who is a Canadian musician. In contrast to borrowing that voice from someone else, there's people like Laura Les from the duo 100gex, who just tone shifts her vocals completely, uses autotune and a variety of multiple effects to do her music. And that's kind of what I try to do myself, actually.
I was struck by something Sophie said in one interview that was like, as a musician, I don't know why you wouldn't want to take advantage of all the instruments that are available, including the electronic ones.
Yes.
Like there's so much that can be done with clanging and with the tones and the kind of, I don't remember how she expressed it, but it was kind of like, as a musician, you should be taking advantage of not just the instruments that have been brought traditionally forward into music, but this new kind of like era where our instruments are all electronic and we can literally create music without touching a piano, without touching a guitar. It can all be tones and MIDI. And I thought that was such a cool way of thinking about it, especially as theater after the pandemic has tried to shift into Zoom, into, electronic versions of itself.
Yeah, like if we keep trying to do theater in the same terms that we were doing theater pre-pandemic, you're not going to get too far with that. And this is really funny because this is something that affected my production. Like I started doing Pseudoantigone during the pandemic for this reason. I happened to have a MacBook Air. I happened to have GarageBand. I decided to get myself a MIDI keyboard. And I just spent close time to it, like for a while. And just kind of getting acquainted with that. Like it's the most full music I've been able to do just because I had all that to take advantage of. I want to say at some point, I tried to make my music so full that it was hard to tell apart what was happening at times. But as it's becoming more mature, you kind of learn what Sophie's saying. Like if you learn to take full advantage of it, you can know how to make the fullest music out of very little. And I think that's an element where like setting a limitation for your work can help you make that work enhance in some ways. I use the metaphor of poetry and its use of metaphor. Poetry recognizes the language has a fundamental deficiency because at a certain point it hits a wall on what it's able to express. But that very limit is where we consider the wealth of expression that poetry does through metaphor. The question is, how can we turn this finitude of expression and turn it into our very own access to the infinite? And that's a Hegelian claim that I'm trying to make sense. So there's a philosophical robustness to this, but it also has a way in which we navigate this as artists. Poetry is an example of it.
The In Process podcast is brought to you by the Canada Council for the Arts and Azimuth Theaters traversing the Azimuth Multimedia branch. It is our aim to continue to introduce and deepen the relationships between our community and the artists within it. To keep this podcast going, go to azimuththeater.com/donate to help with the continuation of this podcast.
So we've talked about your training and we've talked about inspiration in other artists. Where else do you draw inspiration for when you're starting to make music?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned a little bit about like particularly like trans artists and whatnot. I mentioned there are people that borrow voices like Sophie. There's people that affect their voices like Laura Les. And then there's people like Arca or the folks from Canadian duo Black Dresses who don't do anything to their voices necessarily in order to do the music that they make. So I found those three approaches to like trans embodiment in this music. I definitely draw my influences from a lot of different genres. Like the thing is, I've been into music for so long that I dipped my toes in a lot of things. And so I want to say that particularly the last couple years, I've been really interested in some elements of like hip hop, particularly industrial bass. I really like the kind of like gritty industrial bass sound. And actually with some of the tracks that I've been working on, it reflects, like there's a track that I sent you called Dead Name,
Yes.
that it's very much influenced by Shy Girl. Actually, when I played a show last week, I had someone call me out on it.
Oh,
And it was
really?
really good because I'm glad that the influence came across.
How does your setup work in performance?
My setup is very minimal. I use just my laptop, which is a MacBook Air. I just make sure that it's like very clear in terms of sound, in terms of files and whatnot, just so it doesn't like run into any issues. And I use an audio interface. In my case, it basically gives me 2 inputs and 2 outputs to work with. And so through the audio interface, I have my microphone and then the audio interface outputs onto 2 different channels for stereo. And then with that, I run a backing track through Logic Pro X. And then on top of that, I monitor my own vocals. And so my vocals come out of that. Depending on the song, I have multiple vocal tracks just that I have to be switching around. So it's pretty, it might not be the most ideal way to do it just because, for example, like tech won't be able to separate like monitoring my vocals and my backing track. I actually do that myself for myself. So it might not be the best way to do it, but it's how I figure out how to do what I'm doing.
As artists, sometimes to be able to express ourselves, we have to teach ourselves things that we have no idea how to do.
Absolutely. And well, that's kind of how I ended up being my own audio engineer. Like legitimately in years of being in the like music scene, like no one wanted to teach each other like this kind of stuff. A lot of people like to keep their cards to themselves. During the pandemic, I just learned like I'm not going to invest on this space anymore. I'm over it. I don't want to go back to any of that. It's awful. It's not worthwhile.
You don't need to.
And there's cooler stuff happening, so
Yeah.
yeah.
So talking about your upcoming projects and what you've been working on, is there anything specifically, and it doesn't have to be related to your music, but that is exciting you right now?
Yeah, I'll kind of talk about a little bit of the things that I've been up to. Very recently, I released a remix compilation to celebrate the last album I released, Into the Void of Infinite Sadness. Yeah, that got repackaged as Into the Void of Infinite Remix.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. I had a few pals all over Canada and the US send remixes of just different tracks in the album. And so I decided to just like release that as its own kind of thing. And so that was great because honestly, like, Into the Void of Infinite Sadness got me by surprise because I wasn't expecting how much it would pick up.
Yeah, your reception has been insane, hasn't it?
It's been pretty ridiculous. I never thought I would have like a feature, like first of all, like a front page feature in the Edmonton Journal. I wasn't expecting that. When I first sent like all the media kits, I was like, I'll be lucky if it gets played on radio. It was like number 7 in the national charts. Like, so things like that happen, and I'm just like, okay, great. Well, now I know I'm onto something. Maybe let's keep pushing this direction, and now I know how to like get this stuff around. Let's just keep doing it. So, Into the Void of Infinite Sadness had like a considerable like positive reception. It definitely is translating well to live audiences when I'm doing like performance. So yeah, so I celebrated all of this with Into the Void of Infinite remix, and that has just a lot of different pals. So yeah, various remixes throughout it. And then throughout basically the last, I want to say like 4 or 5 months, I've been producing for a lot of different people, again, in the US and Canada. So most recently, I'm currently producing a couple of remixes. So one for the local post-punk band Fitness. Yeah, they're also coming up with their own like remix compilation of sorts. So I got asked to do one, and I'm at it. It's pretty much done. It's just a question of doing a few finicky things. And then one of my pals who also did a remix for my remix compilation, Goddex, so GODDEXX, is doing her own remix compilation and asked me to do one. Still have to finish that remix. I'm at it. It's just been such a slow while to kind of pick up on that. And then there's a musician in Vancouver who I've been producing a song for an EP that that they are working on. So I'm very excited about that one because it's one of my favorite productions. It just sounds so haunting and weird. It's very industrial and haunting sounding. Did I say haunting already? Because it definitely sounds haunting.
So wait, is it haunting?
I think so. So I'm very excited about that one. And so those are kind of the things in the constellation of the work I've been doing. But the big project that I'm working on, this is still probably like rolling into early 2023. It's the second LP. Basically, since July, I started working on a follow-up to Into the Void of Infinite Sadness. What I'm trying to do in my second LP is basically having a self-titled record. It's going to be a double record showcasing the two major trends I've seen in my music production. On the one side, I have very like industrial based stuff, and on the other end, I have very glimmery, like hyperpop, like glammy pop sounding stuff. I kind of decided that looking back at Into the Void of Infinite Sadness, those two trends were already there. But moving on, I wanted to organize them into their own compartmentalized sides so I could just like flesh them out more definitely. And so, yeah, the second LP is going to be a little ambitious. It's going to be a pretty long record with two different sides to it. And I'm still just chipping at it. I've been a little bit busy with work and also other life circumstances that I haven't been able to work on it as much as I wish I have. But it's going to happen. It's pretty much already laid out, so it's on the way.
Now, we've known each other for a while, but this last year, we got to work on The Funeral. That was a staged reading by a playwright here in town called Marina Sanchez. And you got to do sound design for that.
Oh, yeah. That was wild because I had Beth, one of the producers for a Found Festival, just kind of start asking me questions like, hey, would you be ever considering doing this? And I was like, yeah, like I would love to do sound design. I always kind of wanted to do it. I just never had the chance to. And then I got introduced to Marina, and that just kind of lent itself to that. And well, we ended up in a play together doing this. It's wild, and I really like the overall result about it. Like, what was your experience with that? Because you got a different end of it than I.
Yeah, I always find that as an actor, you rehearse and you do your thing, but once you get into technical side of it and once you get into technical rehearsals, there's this beauty that is added with all the elements put together that really kind of brings everything up to a level that you can't, like, of course you can do it without sound design and of course you can do it without beautiful lights, but there's something about once all of those aspects mixed together that really tells the story beautifully. Like every aspect is adding to the storytelling. And I found like, especially with your sound design, it really lent itself to let us as actors play with our emotions within it because there was this beautifully kind of haunting, I don't know if it was a violin.
Carry on. I'm really curious. I can tell you what instrumentation it was.
But there was something underneath it that it almost felt like, again, haunting. It felt like it was something that was coming out from like not in the world, but it was just like almost in your head that you were hearing it. I don't know. It was so beautiful. And I was playing this character called Manolo and it just kind of augmented his struggle of like not wanting to let go of his lover that I thought was just so beautiful.
Yeah, it started at first, like it's a mixture of like orchestral sound and a little bit more electronic production because I wanted to incorporate a little bit of that, but also like I really wanted to make an orchestral piece. I really like composing that kind of stuff. So at the beginning of the track, there's this kind of like ambient sound that's more of a synth rather than like strings. But yeah, there was some type of flute. I think it was an oboe that played across the whole thing. So that kind of gave it a little bit of its a more mystical charm, I want to say.
Yeah, like it had an ethereal vibe to it.
Like it's both wonderfully beautiful, but also kind of scary. One of my favorite elements of composing that piece was doing the instrumentation, just kind of getting this emotional gravitas as he just kind of had this slow rising crescendo. And so it was already doing this slow rising crescendo. And at a certain point where I decided like, okay, this is where it really is going to hit. I added another octave of strings on top of that to give it a sort of like, oh, now it's just like gratingly on your face how emotionally powerful this is. Because the strings are basically screaming at you what's happening. So I added that emotional gravitas of another higher octave of strings just shrieking, but also like a counter string line. So it felt like it had more of a structure going on. And so that was one of my favorite parts in the composition of that track, which culminated into this like, and I think you probably remember this, but this like very daunting drum, just the tune, 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 tune. And the point where it was just like the synth from the beginning and that drum, I love that. I felt like you could just sit in the emotional distress that was built up with all this emotional gravitas of the strings, just having that crescendo and then
Yeah.
just completely going out.
Well, and what I loved about it too is that because the scene was written in Spanish, as the audience, it kind of really helped them understand the context so much better.
I would be really curious about how there was a sort of emotional communication in the music itself. I know that ideally, if I were to do this process again, I would love to be involved in the process just with all of you at once. Like
Yeah.
even watching the scene and composing as I watch the scene. Like, and you know, that always comes down to a project's like question of like time, resources, and scope.
Yeah.
So like, you know, it's not always possible, but we can hope one day.
Hey, the universe is listening, so who knows? It might happen.
Yeah.
and you're right. I mean, like in a perfect world with all the resources, like I would love to see what you would come up with being in the rehearsals and like kind of like hearing the conversations and composing, as you say, like right on the spot.
Yeah. I would love to see like how you folks articulate the drama so I know how to articulate the drama alongside to what you're doing. Yeah, like it'd be fascinating. It was a very interesting experience doing this to begin with. I just want to do it more now.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I want to just get better at being a producer so I'm able to captivate just different sorts of ambiences, experiences, feelings in music. This was an instrumental, so it was just a very particular instance where I was able to captivate that. And it was an interesting instrumental because I had samples of like, you know, background characters just kind of doing this sort of like mental speeches. And that was really fun to play with because there was a little bit of like production that went to creating this kind of haunting echo.
Now, do you find that like that experience has kind of bled into any of your music at all?
It has and it hasn't in some ways, just because the music that I'm making is very focused on, like particularly Pseudo-Antigone is very focused on its two trends of like industrial bass and preliminary hyperpop. But it was a really good opportunity just because even if this is not directly affecting my music, it helped me learn something about music that otherwise I wouldn't have had the chance to do.
Totally. Now, with all the work you're doing, is there anything that like after you've had a long day or a long week, like you will always go back to just to bring some balance and kind of joy into your life?
Yeah, good question. I'm a pretty all over the place person. That's the thing. Like, especially lately, I'm either home for a few days or I'm at my parents' place. So I'm always kind of on the move, and I'm always like doing something for work, maybe working on music if I'm lucky. I would say the most grounding element of my life is like, well, shout out to my partner. Yeah, good vibes there for sure. And also shout out to like reading philosophy. Like, I don't know, I'm always carrying a book with me, and that's just the thing that I do. Like right now I have this book that just got released recently by a philosopher called Todd McGowan on emancipation after Hegel. I'm a Hegel scholar, so I just love coming across new books on him. I always carry like multiple books. The last one I have with me is because I'm taking a course on an introduction course on psychoanalysis for a certificate I'm doing on psychoanalysis. And so I'm straight up reading Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams right now. And it's really interesting because I do very devotedly read Sigmund Freud because I do find his work very fascinating. Even from a trans perspective, I do genuinely think he has a lot to offer. And so, yeah, I'm currently reading his work on dreams.
I always love when people hear me out.
Oh, yes.
But I always love when people enjoy to read.
Oh,
You know?
yeah.
I always wish that was something that was like innate to my life. But I don't know, like I guess when I go to balance or to like relax, the first thing that I look at is like shutting off the brain.
Yeah, it's weird. I feel like I learned to shut off my brain this way because at that point, I'm not doing anything. It's just thinking happening.
Right.
It's not me doing anything. It's just thinking happening. And I'm just like a vessel for it to happen. It's kind of meditative. Like I had people ask me like, how do you meditate at all? I would say this is the closest I get to it.
Now, is there any advice that you'd give to your younger self or to like younger artists who are starting to find their voice in any kind of medium?
Okay, the first thing that I would recommend to my older self, well, my younger self is, hey, you should transition as soon as you can. Yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind. I feel like I waited too long on this one. And, I know that's a sentiment that a lot of trans people sometimes feel, but yeah. Like, I came to this conclusion that I'm trans, like, I want to say, like, 2015 or so, but it was partially circumstantial and, like, sociopolitical nature that, like, made it hard to achieve. But I should have been pushing for that more, I realize.
Yeah.
So transition earlier, or if you're just questioning, maybe question that very actively because it'll take you interesting places. But for artists, I think what allowed me to do what I'm doing right now is literally the fact that I just reconceived my entire practice from the ground up, and it really changed. It changed my life, and it changed the kind of music I do, and it changed many other things I do altogether. So if you're like a musician, I would recommend like get more into various different kinds of music, get outside your box of comfort. Part of what changed what I do is also the fact that I review music. So I'm not just a musician, but I listen to music. And that was a bit important for learning to ask questions about what do I want to do with the music that I'm doing. So, let yourself be fully transformed in the substance of what you're doing. You'll find yourself that the substance of your music and yourself will come out of the other end completely transformed. It's really tough, but yeah, like, creating your own sense of artistic discipline and commitment, and also just like, imposter syndrome is something that does come up a lot, but also getting past imposter syndrome to the point of like, okay, I don't care about being an imposter. Mostly like I'm trying to hit my own standards as high as I can, set them if I can help it myself too, and just really like get myself to do the best I can. And that's really the only goal to hit. Like, I want to do better. I want to do my best and try to learn how to do more than what I am right now, because I don't want to be stuck at being what I am. I mean, that's literally part of trans embodiment for me. I don't want to be stuck in a body that doesn't feel like myself. Being myself takes a lot of work of becoming. It's not something that you're given immediately. The self is something that you in some ways have to give away and also make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's an ever-evolving journey, no matter what. Going deeper into yourself is always going to bring up more things, more challenges, more growth that you have to embrace to be able to kind of level up,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, there's certain points where, like, you can be doing little progresses of, like, growth and whatnot. You can get to a point where you do, like, a quantum leap, and you're just in a completely different point where you can't even measure yourself by the terms of before. And those are the interesting moments, because it just completely shifts the entire point of view of what you're doing. And it's important to strive for moments where you just almost don't recognize what was happening beforehand.
Totally. I love that. Now, here's a hard-hitting question,
Okay.
right? Prepare yourself. What's your favorite treat?
Oh, okay. This is easy. Actually, hold on.
Do you have it in your backpack?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you
I was
do.
hanging out with my partner yesterday, and I picked this up from Shoppers. These are chocolate raisins.
Chocolate raisins. I love that you raised them up to the mic, too.
Well, the microphone has to hear them. Like, our audience can't see them, so they have to experience them somehow. Here's some chocolate raisin ASMR.
I love it.
Anyways, I love chocolate raisins. Ever since I was young, my mom told me that raisins would make me smart, and then I was like, well, I'm gonna eat a lot of them. And here I am talking philosophy and talking about chocolate raisins.
I mean, your mom was not wrong.
I'm glad that you asked this question. I'm happy I had an answer, like, literally in my person.
I am, honestly, you're the first person to actually be like, this is it.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be that person.
And to kind of close it all off, and in kind of like that looking in the future kind of beauty of it, do you have like a dream project that like maybe you're not working on right now, but like, you see yourself 5-10 years from now?
After the second LP, I want to take a bigger break in my music, just to like learn more about audio engineering and get more experimental in the work that I'm doing. But my dream is to produce more stuff that has that sort of like breadth and complexity in sound design. So, gosh, if I could achieve it, I would love to collaborate with Arca. I would love to produce for people like Shy Girl. I would love to produce even for some people who I kind of have some like friendships with. Yeah, I just want to get to a point where I can do more of this, and also like, I don't know, if I can use like teach philosophy as a professor and do music, that would be the dream for me.
Like the coolest professor in town.
That's the thing. I was telling my partner this when we went for a walk yesterday, but I would teach only 3 courses as a sessional professor: a course on Hegel, a course on Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis, and a course on the philosophy of love. That's it. And then I would just be doing like music and like, like artistic production and arts management type stuff.
I know this is completely sideways, but you mentioned the philosophy of love.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little bit of a taste?
Oh boy, it's complex because it depends philosopher to philosopher. But like and this I would consider to be the work that I'm doing towards like a thesis in philosophy, if I decide to go for a PhD, which I want to. It derives a lot from Hegel and psychoanalysis, dealing with the question of how. Okay, I would summarize it in some simple terms. What I learned from many of these philosophers about love is that love is this kind of radical emancipatory experience where we learn to, in a sense, let go of ourselves, can avoid ourselves of ourselves, make a space, an emptiness, where we're able to receive each other. Not just receive each other, but it's almost this promissory space where we're able to promise each other the future. I think this question of love particularly answers to a struggle that is very contemporary. That the very notion of the future is closing up. We're not able to envision any future. Capitalism is basically making it so the future is already saturated by capital.
Yeah.
So we can't see any future past capitalism, for the better or the worse. Not only that, but it's actually, in a materialist sense, the future is basically culminating in environmental destruction and whatnot. The future feels like it's a category in crisis. What I see in the philosophy of love is this potential avenue for a rehabilitation of the future, and what it means to rehabilitate the future. Not being caught up in a perpetual self-referential perpetuation of the self, but almost this like yielding away, this way of going through this kind of letting go of ourselves to make a space in each other to see the future, to promise each other a future. So if I were to say there's a key thesis that I'm concerned with the philosophy of love, is that rehabilitation of the future and the capacity to see something last.
Wow. And on that note, I just want to say thank you so much, friend. Like, seriously, from the bottom of my heart, this has been such a beautiful gift to talk to you, to get to actually spend an hour and sit here and just get to know you more. I just thank you seriously from the bottom of my heart. This has been a beautiful gift, and I hope you've also had fun doing it.
Oh, I'm enjoying myself plenty. Thank you for having me here, Andrés.
Hey, pal.
Enjoying the conversation? Traversing the Azimuth is a brand new branch of Azimuth Theater, aimed at connecting artists with a wider community, deepening mutual understanding, and getting to share each artist's process and journey.
If you would like to continue hearing these amazing stories, you can help out by going to azimuththeater.com/sponsorship and sponsor Traversing the Azimuth. Your sponsorship will go straight into paying more artists to come and share what it means for them to be proudly in process.
We would also like to take this moment to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their support in the pilot of this project.
For more information on Traversing the Azimuth, go to azimuththeater.com/traversing.